Brownies, or alternatively Brownies, are a variety of household spirit from British folklore. To talk about brownies, we first need to talk about tutelary spirits, which are guardians of specific things like places or geographic features, occupations, cultures, nations, even individual people and their bloodlines. Specifically, we need to talk about the lair, and to do that, we need to talk about the ancient Etruscans. The Etruscans were an ancient people that were sort of the proto-Italians, or Italians, if you will. They first emerged from the primeval pasta sauce around 900 BC, and they were around as late as 27 BC when the last of their cities were formally absorbed by their Roman neighbors. Rome got a lot from the Etruscan people. One particular bit of culture they adopted was the concept of the tutelary spirit. In fact, the Roman term for these spirits, the lair, is an Etruscan word meaning lord, as in lord of the household in the case of the variety of lair we're talking about today. These household protectors were so ingrained in Roman life that even after all non-Christian cults were banned in the 4th century AD, there were still unofficial lairs cults operating a century later. So they were pretty important. People still worshipped them even though everything about them was outlawed. The lair, as seen in these figurines, is always a small, youthful, sprightly male figure, clad in very rustic attire, which, as we'll see, translates almost directly into the brownies of the British Isles. Now, lairs had a few functions. Basically, they watched over a house, and members of the household would house them in a special shrine called a lairarium, as seen here. This one is from Pompeii. As well, they would offer them bits of food like wheat, alcohol, honey, fruits, things like that, which were set in the lairarium. In return, the lair was believed to keep the house and its occupants safe from harm and ensured prosperity for the family. Now, when Rome conquered parts of Britannia, Roman tradition came along with them, and one of those traditions was the lair, which in all likelihood is where the brownie comes from. Because brownies are depicted as small, sprightly males, either naked or dressed in rags. They dwell at the hearth of the home, which is where the lairarium would likely be in a Roman household, and they require offerings of things like fruit, milk, honey, or bread, just like a lair. Where brownies begin to come into their own, however, is the fact that they are not bound to a home, like the lair is. Brownies are mobile, and they'll leave if they're unhappy with their current household. One such brownie story tells of a woman who fired all the household servants to save money because the brownie was doing all the chores for them each night. And the brownie became enraged at this, left the house, and refused to return until all the servants were rehired. Also, unlike the lair, brownies are believed to do housework, which the lair never did. They just nebulously made the house prosperous. Brownies would actually be believed to sweep, tidy things up, tend to animals, all kinds of stuff. They always work alone at night and while the owners of the house are asleep. They make a specific effort in most stories to avoid being seen, apparently even by each other, as it was incredibly rare for a single home to have more than one brownie. They also apparently punish lazy or sloppy household servants by pinching them in their sleep or breaking things in their vicinity to get them in trouble. Sometimes apparently brownies were also just assholes for their own amusement and would do things like make messes or just make loud noises in the middle of the night. But the concept of this creature, this brownie, this magical household spirit, was at one point so omnipresent in parts of England that in 1703, John Brand, a minister at the time, wrote of them. Not above 40 or 50 years ago, every family had a brownie, or evil spirit so-called, which served them, to which they gave a sacrifice for his service, as when they churned their milk, they took a part thereof and sprinkled every corner of the house with it for brownies' use. Likewise, when they brewed, they had a stone which they called Brownie's stain, wherein there was a little hole in which they poured some wort for a sacrifice to Brownie. They also had some stacks of corn, which they called Brownie stacks, which, though they were not bound with straw ropes or in any way fenced as other stacks used to be, the greatest storm of wind was not able to blow away straw off them. John Brand, 1703. As mentioned before, brownies are a very mobile spirit, and unlike the lair, they'll leave a household if they're unhappy, and apparently there's a lot of ways to make them unhappy. They get offended if a human sees them working, criticizes their work, or laughs at them. In one story called The Brownie of Cranshaw's in Berwickshire, This brownie mowed and threshed all the farm's grain for many, many years until someone mentioned that the grain had been poorly mown and stacked. This prompted the brownie to, that night, carry all the grain to Raven Crag 2 miles away and hurl it all off the cliff while muttering, "It's no will mowed, it's no will mowed. It's ne'er be mowed by me again. I'll scatter it o'er the Ravenstein and they'll have some work ere it's mowed again." In other cases, attempting to baptize the brownie, or even give him a name at all, can make him vanish. A brownie who haunted the Almer Burn in Perthshire would often be heard splashing in the water. He was said to go up to the nearby farm every night with wet feet, and if anything was untidy, he would put it in order, but if anything was tidy, he would hurl it around and make a mess. The people of the area feared him, and they did not go near the road leading up from the water at night. Until one day a man who was returning from the market at night heard him splashing in the water and called out to him, addressing him by the nickname Puddlefoot. Puddlefoot exclaims in horror, "I've got a name! 'Tis Puddlefoot they call me!" and then vanished forever and was never heard from again. Perhaps the strangest way to remove a brownie, however, is to give him clothing. If the homeowner left clothing out for the brownie, they would leave forever, often angrily. One brownie at Berwickshire is said to have found a gift of clothing and before vanishing angrily declared, "Give Brownie a coat, give Brownie a sock, you'll get nemmer a Brownie's work." Why does that happen? I have no idea. Presumably because mythology is fucking weird. Some brownies did not simply vanish, but would move to other farms when offended. In Welsh country, where they're called Wubbocs, John Rhys, not that one, a folklorist, recorded in 1901 a story from Monmouthshire about a woman who would leave a bowl of cream out each night for a Wubbock. One night as a prank, she instead fills the bowl with stale urine. What the hell, lady? This prompts the Wubbock to, probably rightly, attack her before he leaves for a neighboring farm. A girl there fed him well, and he did her spinning for her. But she wanted to know his name, which he refused to tell. Then one day, when she pretended to be out, she heard him singing his name, which was Gwarwynathrot, and so he had to leave and go to another farm, where he became close friends with the manservant, whose name was Moses. After Moses was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field, Gwarwynathrot became despondent and angry and began wreaking havoc across the whole town until an old wise man banished him into the Red Sea. Brownies actually exist in folklore all over the world, and if you've ever wondered why we leave milk and cookies out for Santa, well, that's why. Leaving an offering of sweet breads and milk by the hearth so a magical man you must not see will come out of it and do you a favor should sound pretty familiar now, as should a certain magical house elf who is freed by giving him an article of clothing. We'll close out our examination of brownies with a famous tale about one, the story of Hubo, the Tensei brownie. One cold, wet, and windy winter night, the farmer of Tensei had just climbed wearily into his box bed when he saw something in the corner of his room. There sat an ugly, naked creature with a wet, leathery skin that seemed to glow softly in the darkness. The visitor was somewhat smaller than a man, and was certainly terribly ugly with a flat, bald head and wet, slimy seaweed as a beard. Although the sight of this unwanted intruder alarmed the poor farmer, he was a man with a hasty temper and, fortunately, a quick wit. From his talks with the old folk on the mainland, he remembered that only cold steel and the word of God could be depended upon against creatures of sorcery. So, seizing a razor from a shelf in his bed, he pulled out a dog-eared psalm book from under his pillow. Springing from his bed, he landed softly on the cold flagstones, ready to do battle with the repulsive intruder. But despite the fact that he saned himself with the psalm book and drew a circle in the air with the blade of his razor, the visitor remained in the corner, gibbering at him. Exasperated, the farmer snatched the fire tongs and poker from the hearth and sent them hurtling towards the squatting creature, but the intruder was swift and avoided them with ease. His temper finally broken, the farmer lifted the heavy crook from its chain above the fire and, with a roar, tried to get closer to his adversary. The crook, however, was made of soft iron from the smithy, not of steel, so the creature plucked it quickly from the farmer's trembling hand and threw it across the room. Now, even more angered, the farmer lashed out and managed to hit the intruder twice before it darted through the doorway with a squeal. To get his breath and gather his wits, the farmer sat down on a straw stool and slowly his temper began to cool. He reflected that while he had done his best to disable the intruder, it had actually made no attempt to injure him. With this in mind, when it re-entered the room, grinning and making friendly gestures, the farmer remained seated and tried to understand what it was saying. The Brownie, for so he was afterwards known, said that his name was Hubo. He explained to the farmer that he'd always lived in the sea, but was now sick of gnawing the bones of drowned men. It was his dearest wish that he remained on the land. In order to fulfill this, he was willing to work well for his lodging. The farmer grudgingly agreed, and they decided that each night Hubo would use the kern to grind sufficient meal for the farmer's breakfast porridge the next morning. All the creature asked in return was a saucer of milk to sup with his own handful of parched barley. The farmer was a busy man and at heart a hospitable one. This arrangement pleased him well. He quickly got over his disgust at the Brownie's appearance, and the bargain was made. The farmer went back to bed while in the background the low, gritty scraping of the kern went on throughout the night. By the time the feeble winter sun crept timidly over the horizon, there was a bowl of clean, well-ground oatmeal waiting for the farmer as he climbed from beneath the covers. True to his word, Hubo became a valued servant. Sometimes the farmer would talk with him, but more often lay silent in the darkness of his bed and watched as the clumsy glowing figure industriously turned the millstone. Just as the millstone turned, the wheel of life turned ever onwards, and Hubo seemed content with his lot. Now, it happened that the farmer had a sweetheart. This girl lived on the Orkney mainland, and the two were pledged to be married. But it had recently occurred to the farmer that it would be most unwise to bring the girl back to Tensei until she had become accustomed to Hubo. So he told his sweetheart about the strange servant, making sure she understood the creature's faithfulness and good nature. Then, to make sure of her acceptance, he took her to the island on several occasions so she might meet the creature. The girl was a sensible sort, and like many, knew well that there were many things in Orkney that mortal men knew little about. Therefore, she did not object to sharing her new home with the Brownie. So in due course, a marriage was celebrated and the bride moved out to Tensei. As should be the case, there were better things for bride and groom to do than pay over much attention to Hubo, but the girl's love for her husband flowed over to include the naked figure who spent the hours of darkness grinding meal. At nights, while snuggled up in her warm bed, the girl imagined that poor Hubo must be shivering in the cold of an Orkney night, and this pained her kindly heart. In addition to this, of course, she was ever so slightly embarrassed by the extent of Hubo's nakedness, of which the creature was entirely unashamed. Without telling her beloved husband or the Brownie, the girl obtained a length of good, warm cloth from Kirkwall. From it, she fashioned a warm cloak with an ample hood to cover Hubo's bald crown. Then, one windy, moonless night, she placed the completed garment on the kern, pleased with herself for the good act she had performed. It was usual for Hubo to come in quietly to carry out his task, but on this fateful night he had no sooner entered the room than he began a dismal howling. Round and round the kern he ran, sobbing his heart out and repeating, "Hubo's gotten cloak and hood, so Hubo can do no more good." And with that he flew out into the darkness of Orkney night and was never seen again.